Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ans Performance. So this is part 2 of our connective tissue elasticity and the throwing velocity series. All right, so if you haven't checked out part 1, check that out. That'll give you all the kind of the background you need and the factors we're going to be discussing today. But this will be primarily focused on the practical application side of things. All right. So let's first kind of discuss why was connective tissue and its impact on throwing velocity ignored for so long. All right. So one of the really important things is it's a hard thing to objectively measure, and certainly even harder to measure kind of in our environment, right, outside of like a lab. Okay. So that's kind of one reason is like it's hard to measure. So how much do we really care about it if we can't kind of measure what we're doing anyway? The next piece is it takes a long time to adapt. So while muscles adapt relatively quickly, fascia can take like 6 to 24 months to improve its kind of elasticity, according to Thomas Myers, right? So we have really long adaptation windows, hard things to objectively kind of look at and measure. So those things kind of coupled together just kind of led to it getting thrown out to some degree. So we're going to talk about kind of how do we go about changing those factors discussed in part 1 to kind of improve that throwing velocity and output side of things. So kind of the first thing to think about when we're talking about changing kind of connective tissue properties are they work really well with sessions kind of spaced out about 6 hours. This is according to Dr. Keith Barr, who's kind of the expert in this kind of realm. And so kind of what that means is the movements and kind of exercises focused at changing connective tissue should be performed first in a session, because they're also going to be short duration sessions. We're talking about like the first 10-15 minutes are really going to be what makes the biggest impact on that connective tissue, just kind of based on like the way the collagen works and all of that, which is discussed in other pieces that I've kind of written and done on here before as well. So that's kind of the first piece to remember: short duration sessions spaced about kind of 6 hours apart. So kind of the next piece of this is, so then how do we go after kind of the specific factors discussed earlier, right? The range of motion, the timing, kind of all of those pieces together. What do we do training wise to affect those? Okay, so in terms of improving range of motion, right? If that's currently a limiting factor, you're going to want to improve that, right? Because as we talked about in part 1 of this, the longer kind of ranges of motion are going to give us a greater stretch on these elastic elements. So if we're limited in our range of motion, we're going to want to improve that to some degree. So how do we go about doing this? Well, eccentrics are one way that we can go about doing this, kind of such as those present at the beginning of a plyometric action. And so what they kind of can do is they may add more compliance at shorter muscle lengths and greater stiffness at longer muscle lengths, which is a pretty exciting thing if you think about it, because what's then going to happen is we can get through deeper ranges of motion, right? So we can put more stretch on that, and then we can get these kind of faster shortening velocities at those end ranges, all right? So we get kind of the best of both worlds in terms of more range of motion, kind of higher output at the end of it. So eccentrics are one way we can really improve that range of motion. All right, so athletes who lack adequate stiffness, how do we go about improving this? So as discussed earlier, we want to see kind of high velocity movements, all right? So kind of what this means is like if you measure an athlete on like an RSI or a reactive strength index test and they score really poorly on that, you could probably assume they're not very stiff. The other piece is you could just watch somebody. If they're plodding along and they're not bouncing off the floor, they're probably not stiff enough. And so kind of the way we go about improving this is kind of these higher velocity movements. Heavier loads to some degree can work, as well as overcoming isometrics are all kind of prescriptions we can use to improve kind of this connective tissue stiffness to get this better output. All right, so improving performance kind of based on the proprioceptors involves kind of raising the cutoff at which these things kind of sense danger. So if we think about kind of heavy loads and through a full range of motion, this kind of helps both kind of the GTO and the muscle spindles kind of discussed earlier, right? So the muscle spindles will kind of sense that danger a little bit later in the range of motion, kind of like we talked about, right? So we're going to get a greater stretch on those elastic elements by going deeper. And then on kind of the heavier load side of things, the Golgi tendon organ is going to get more desensitized to these heavier loads. So when we get that kind of sense of a great magnitude or velocity of stretch, that force output from the muscle is going to be even greater, because that governor is either going to is like kind of turned off or at least raised at the level at which it can kind of apply that force to some degree. So heavy loads and full range of motion training for the GTO and the muscle spindles are going to be really important factors. All right, so kind of the last two factors when we're talking about kind of how we lay out our training to kind of affect the connective tissue is going to be properly progressed and varied plyometrics. So when we talk about kind of training plyometrics, we want to talk about training from an extensive to an intensive kind of manner. So we think about lower intensity, higher volume in the beginning, that'd be your extensive side. We have a whole video on this. If you haven't checked that out, check that out as well. And then we get intensive, right? Higher intensity, kind of lower volumes as we go through this. So the extensive stuff does a couple of things. So it allows us to kind of work on that rhythm and that smoothness of the movement because we're practicing stuff that we're going to be using at a higher intensity later. So there's some familiarity there. The second piece is kind of we're adapting the nervous system and those tissues kind of specifically to what we're going to ask them to do later. So when we have this high intensity, the risk of injury is much lower. All right. So kind of all of those things are super important. And then on the variety side, right? So training specifically towards an adaptation is very important, but if we have not enough variety in our training, when we have to kind of make these minor adjustments when we're on the mound or in the field or making a play or whatever it might be, the risk of injury becomes greater. So we want enough variety in our program that we're prepared for a lot of different things while that adaptation is still focused. So this kind of goes kind of towards that vertical integration model where we can train everything just to kind of varying degrees. And so you want to think about this when we're talking about variation in our training as well. So connective tissue kind of helps to connect these movements throughout the kinetic chain, all right? So we could be kind of transferring and amplifying this force and energy that we've kind of talked about throughout this process. So while connective tissue takes a longer time to adapt than muscles, if we can leverage the stiffness, the range of motion, the timing, and kind of the reflexes to improve our output, your throwing velocity is likely to greatly improve from this. So while it could be kind of a pain to not see these adaptations for a long period of time, if you're willing to kind of put in the time and do some of maybe the quote unquote boring things, these outputs down the line are going to be higher than you will with kind of a traditional approach. All right. So thanks for checking out this video. If you have questions, feel free to comment below. Feel free to shoot us an email if you're interested in training with us. Shoot us an email as well. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching.